Hi everyone, this is Zach Rubin, and I'm joined today with our presenter, Art Markman, who will be speaking about how cognitive science can be applied to careers, which I know for many of us right now is very relevant given the global pandemic. I'll give a little bit of background for the webinar today and then introduce Art, who can take it away. Art's going to plan to have plenty of time for your questions, so please click the Ask a Question button at any point, and that's just below the video to ask your questions, and we'll have time for them at the end of the presentation. And you can also feel free to check out the link to Art's book on this topic in the resources section of the page. Let me give a quick introduction. Art is a professor, author, and popular radio host. His area of expertise is psychology and cognitive science, and his research in these areas have covered a range of topics, including career development. He serves as the executive director of the IC2 Institute, which is a think and do tank that focuses on innovation and entrepreneurship. The current mission of the Institute is to explore rural and small city economic development in the US and around the world. And thanks so much for sharing with us today, Art, and I'll let you take it away.
Thanks, Zach. It's really great to be here today. Welcome, everybody, and I hope that everybody is staying healthy and safe. We can think of today as the special pandemic version of Bring Your Brain to Work. What I want to do today is talk a little bit about what we know from psychology about thinking about careers and the career path that includes that process of getting a job, succeeding at a job, and thinking about the next one. And I want to do that in the context that all of us are facing right now, which is an era in which we are dealing in one way or another with the fallout of the coronavirus. So to get started, I just want to talk a little bit about the variety of aspects of your mind, of your brain that you need to bring to work. One of the things I do in the book is to distinguish between three systems, three brains, if you will, that are critical for your success at work, and then a fourth bonus brain. Those three brains are your cognitive brain, which is the mechanisms that you use to really think and reason through things. Your motivational brain, the one that engages to help you to achieve your goals, as well as your social brain, the one that really has all of the mechanisms that are associated with helping you to get along with other people. And then the bonus brain is the jazz brain. One of the remarkable things about human thought is our ability to adapt to new situations on the fly and to improvise in situations. And about 15 years ago, I took up the saxophone, thinking at the time it would just be a great way to learn to do something else, not realizing that it would actually feed back on the way that I think about thinking and the way that people navigate their environments. So in the context of those types of mechanisms, what is it that we can begin to think about with careers? Well, one thing, of course, right now is that, as we know, 30 million people, over 30 million people have lost their jobs in the last several months as a result of the economic downturn that has followed the pandemic. And that's put a lot of people in a situation of really suddenly perhaps needing to look for work. And some of those folks may be fairly new to the job market, but others may have had careers for an awfully long time and are now having to rethink how to navigate the job market. One of the things that I think is really important to do at a time like this is to take stock motivationally of your underlying values. So there's a lot of research by Shalom Schwartz and his colleagues that has illuminated the variety of values that people hold. And if you look across cultures, there are roughly 10 different values that seem to characterize differences between people. And those values involve things like achievement. There are some people who really value being recognized for being successful, where there are also values like benevolence. Benevolence is valuing doing things for other people. There are folks who value tradition, really want to see things cleave to their culture. There are people who value hedonism, pleasure. Their focus is primarily on doing things that are enjoyable in the moment. Others who value security. What they really care about more than anything else is keeping safe. And the reason that these values are important is because the values that we have come to us through a variety of factors. Some of them are transmitted to us from our culture, from our upbringing, and some are ones that we adopt as we move to adulthood and try to figure out how we engage with the world. And the jobs that we take, the careers that we have, will cross-cut those values in various ways. And the more that you can engage in work that allows you to express those values that are nearest and dearest to you, the more likely you are to really feel at home in the work that you do. And I think that this is an interesting time because a number of people who now find themselves potentially out of work or in an uncertain environment in which they might actually be forced to leave the job that they're in sometime in the future, this is an opportunity to really ask, is the kind of work that I do on a daily basis one that fits with my underlying values? And if not, what could I do potentially to change that? What career paths might help me to express those values in a different way? And it may be that the job that you took on was one that you felt was going to fit with your values, but the actual practice of the work didn't quite meet up to that. But sometimes also it's just that over the course of your life, your values shift. There may be things that you valued when you were younger and don't value later. That's a natural thing to have happen. So for example, a number of people enter their career really valuing achievement, feeling like being recognized for being a success is the most important thing, but later on begin to realize that there are other things that are more important to them, that they would rather be of service to the people around them, for example, or that they would prefer not to be in a stressful environment and that security is more important. So finding a way at this time to think about that alignment between your values and the values that are associated with the job you do, I think is extraordinarily important. And then to use that to guide future decisions about your career path. Now, of course, one of the hard things right now is being noticed in a job search because there are a lot of people out there. One of the things to bear in mind is that those folks who are in the process of applying for jobs, we have to recognize that recruiters and hiring managers go through a two-stage process when they evaluate applications that have come in. The first stage that they're in is a stage of rejection, where they're trying to take the large number of applications they got, whittle that down to a small number. From a cognitive brain standpoint, when you're in the mode of rejection, what you're looking for is reasons to get rid of something. And so one of the things you want to do as you put together a packet of materials is to try to minimize the easy reasons for your application to be rejected, which means even little things like double and triple checking the cover letter that you put together to make sure that you've got the right company name at the top. Nothing makes it easier for someone to reject an application than for it to be addressed to the wrong firm. But also to look at those things that are weaknesses in your application and to try to address those as much as possible early on, to give people, to make it harder for people to create a reason to reject your application. Recognizing that after that initial phase of rejection, now the task shifts and there's more of a focus on who do I really want to bring out for an interview. So now there's a shift in focus to acceptance rather than rejection. And now the focus is going to be on what is the reason I have to want to interview this person. And so it's really important to help to create the story that someone could use to justify including your application in a list of people who are going to be interviewed. And so when you write a cover letter, it's important not just to talk about your qualifications, but really to begin to weave a story that helps someone to see why they would have an easy reason to want to include you in the list of people who are being considered. From a social brain standpoint, one of the things that's really important to do is to engage with a variety of people who can help to guide the path of your career, whether you're currently looking for a job or whether you are already ensconced in one. One of the interesting things is that every firm that I know of talks about the importance of mentorship. So they often, in fact, they do a terrible job of it despite caring about it. What many firms do is on your first week on the job, they assign you a mentor, and you and that mentor go out for a cup of coffee, or these days, I suppose you'd have that cup of coffee virtually via Zoom. And then after that initial very pleasant conversation, you don't ever speak to them again because it turns out they don't really know what you need and they don't necessarily have the information that you want. So instead of trying to be assigned a mentor in this inorganic way, I think it is important for all of us to try to create our own mentoring team and to use that throughout our careers to move forward in the work we do and also to help us to think about the next stages of that career path. Now, mentoring team needs to include a variety of people. One of them is somebody I call a superstar. You want to find somebody out there who has the career that you aspire to, that you think, if I had that person's career, I would be a happy person. And really just find out from them, what do they do that has led them to the position that they're in? What is the philosophy behind the way that they do their work? And really just give you that, let them take that opportunity to teach you a little bit about how it is that they've arrived at the place where they are. And you just reach out, you can just reach out to people from the place where you're working or other people you admire, ask a few questions, and you'd be surprised how often people are willing to be generous with their time because they've had other people who've helped them over the years. It's also really important, in addition to a superstar, to find somebody who's a really good coach. Coaches are people who are not going to tell you what to do. They're going to walk you through the process of doing what it is that you need to do. In the same way that if you're learning to hit a baseball, the coach doesn't hit the baseball for you, but they influence your form in ways that make you a better hitter. What you want is someone who can walk you through the scenarios you face at work. And rather than just giving you advice, give you the questions that you need to be asking yourself in that situation in order to do what you do more effectively, so that the next time you face a situation like that, you can begin to ask those questions for yourself by hearing that coach's voice in your head. I think it's really important also to have someone in a firm that you're working for who knows who to talk to get things done, who really has that organizational chart internalized. Because one of the things about every organization is that when you're trying to get something done, if you don't get to the right person and you don't ask that person for help in the right way, then your best ideas are not necessarily going to get pushed forward. And so I think it's really important to have someone who can help you to find the right kinds of people in your organization, but also people who are good connectors within your field. This is particularly important in moments like this, where because of the amount of uncertainty there is around people's jobs, it is useful to have connections to other firms because the old adage that it's who you know, not what you know, that matters, bears a certain amount of truth in situations like this as well. When a hiring manager is looking to hire someone, they're going to certainly look at the applications that come through. But if they have an application from a known quantity, that is going to influence their thoughts about who to hire more than anything else. And so if you can get an introduction to people who are hiring through someone that you know, that's valuable. So having people who can play that role to help guide you through a career, I think, is extraordinarily important. And then finally, it's always useful to have a really good colleague that you can vent with, because every day at work has its joys and its frustrations. And what you want to do is to have somebody who you can just talk to about things, explore what's going on in your life, who will let you complain for about 5 minutes, after which they'll just say, great, now what are you going to do about it? You don't want to just gripe about things, but you do want to have that social experience of being understood and then being forced to think forward about how you're going to do things more effectively in the future. Now, one of the elements of succeeding at work that's really important and that is particularly difficult at this time is communication. So human communication is optimized for what you could think of as the evolutionary environment in which we grew up as a species. We grew up in fairly small groups where people would know each other and share a common background and have conversations together. And so human communication works most effectively when we have conversations with people we know in small groups, face to face, in real time. And the further away we get from that, the harder it is to communicate effectively. So if we are communicating with people at a distance over a platform like Zoom, that makes it harder to communicate. If we're communicating by text all of the time, then we're losing tone of voice, we're losing facial expression and other things that can make it hard to know what it is that someone means. I'll give you a quick example. I got an email yesterday in response to a general statement that I made to a group yesterday, and somebody sent me a response that was intended to be a joke. And in retrospect, it was pretty funny, but I didn't recognize it as a joke. It didn't have the tone of voice coming along with it, and so and the eye roll that it would have been required in order to understand that. And I ended up answering the question that someone raised that was meant to be ironic seriously, and that those kinds of miscommunications, I think, can happen all the time over, as we get further and further away from this ideal situation. And of course, here we are in this pandemic. We are communicating with people rarely in the ideal situation of small groups face to face in real time. At best, we are having conversations using platforms like Zoom and Skype and Microsoft Teams, and at worst, it's on Slack and text mediated and things like that. What that means is we have to work extra hard to make sure that we are reaching out to our colleagues. And there are several elements of this that I think we have to do. One of them is to try to schedule just very short check-ins with some of the people that we work with. I think that's really important because the kind of happenstance interactions that we have around the water cooler in the workplace are not going to happen when you're at home and working. And a lot of the other meetings that we schedule have that horrible Hollywood Squares format where you don't really feel like you're able to make eye contact with anyone or to have a real conversation. Having a very quick check-in over the phone, having a very quick Skype meeting is a great way of feeling a little bit more connected socially with your colleagues. It builds trust a little bit. And one of the things that's really important is when you make a lot of requests of other people over email, they can't hear your tone of voice. If I ask you to do something in the workplace because I need a favor, I can walk into your office or poke my head into a cubicle and say, listen, I really hate to bother you, but I could use some help with this. Have you got the time? And even if that request is really a demand, if for example, I'm in a position where I can really tell you to do something, framing it in that more collegial way greases the wheels for people to feel like they're being collaborative. No matter how you write that same request over email, it comes off sounding harsher. And unless people can really hear your voice in their heads, how can they are less likely to feel connected to you in that moment. And so it's really important to keep checking in with people so that when you do communicate with them over text, they are still hearing your voice, seeing your face as behind the work that's being done. So we really have to be extra careful in the way that we communicate. The other thing that's really important, more important right now than ever, is to be very explicit about what we are thinking about and what we mean. And when you're face to face with people, there are a lot of times where if someone is confused about what you're saying, they're going to display that on their face. So you might make a statement, and if they don't understand it, they'll look at you funny. You know, they'll sort of tilt their head in the way the dogs do when you're talking to them, and you immediately know that you've lost them, that they don't really know what it is that you meant. But when you do these things over text, or even in a large group setting in a meeting on one of these other platforms, you lose a lot of the ability to see when you've lost the audience. I give a lot of talks, for example, and often I give them in front of an audience. Right now, I can't see any of you, so I'm hopeful that you're listening, but I have no idea. And I have no idea how what I'm saying is going over. That same thing is happening in meetings. And so one of the things that means is you've got to ask explicitly. If there is an assumption you're making, then one of the things you want to do is to ask people directly for feedback. You also want to be really explicit about assumptions that you're making that might be obvious if you were face to face, but might be less obvious if you're not. Because a key part of communication involves what's called common ground. When I make a statement to you, I assume that there's some amount of knowledge that we share. So for example, when I talk about Zoom, I assume you know what I'm talking about. And it's a pretty safe assumption since that's been a widespread platform being used to have meetings. But if you didn't know what Zoom was and I kept talking about this Zoom thing, then I'm making an assumption that could be wrong. It can be useful for me to be explicit about those assumptions, because I am more likely to go off and say things you don't understand when we're not face to face in real time. So one of the things about communicating with your colleagues at a time like this is you got to just go over the top to check your assumptions with people, and to ask several times for feedback to make sure that people are willing to tell you when they haven't understood something that you've asked them about. So productivity is fundamentally going to be influenced by the effectiveness of communication. And we are in a situation right now in which it is simply hard to communicate as effectively as we'd like to. Another aspect, to move on, another aspect of being successful in the workplace. So if we think about this career path from trying to find a job to being successful at that job to ultimately finding a new job later, another element of being successful is your ability to stay productive. And a lot of people right now are having a lot of trouble staying productive at work, even though even though we have a lot of time on our hands, because we're not commuting, for example. Often a lot of people are working from home. It can be very difficult to stay focused. And one of the big reasons for that has to do with an element of our motivational system that responds to threat. So the human motivational system has two distinct modes to it. It has an approach mode and it has an avoidance mode. The approach mode is the one that engages when there's a beautiful, wonderful, desirable thing out there in the environment that you're going after. The avoidance mode is the one that we engage when there is a threat or calamity on the horizon. And right now we are living in an era with actually two distinct threats, one of which is the threat of the coronavirus and a threat to our health and safety. And the other is an economic threat, in which the social distancing that we are engaging in order to avoid getting more people sick is also harming the economy and making it harder for people to engage in their work and making it harder for firms to stay profitable. And so one of the things we have to recognize is that there is this what's called an avoidance conflict, in which the actions that we take in order to avoid one threat actually make the other threat worse. This is part of the reason why there is so much tension in people between social distancing and wanting to stay safe, and wanting to do things to reopen the economy. In addition to the politics that have been placed over that, there's just a fundamental aspect of human motivation that's at play. Now, one of the reasons why this is particularly important in the workplace is because not only are there specific threats in the environment, the pandemic on the one hand and potential economic problems on the other, but there's research by Torrey Higgins and his colleagues on what's called regulatory focus. And one of the things that's interesting about this work is that when you are engaged in trying to achieve some wonderful, beautiful, desirable outcome, some specific outcome, you also become more sensitive in general to potential positive outcomes in the world. And when you are trying to avoid a specific threat or calamity, you actually become more sensitive to other threats in the environment. Now, the reason that this is important is that this era in which there is a lot of chaos, a lot of economic chaos, a lot of uncertainty about the future, because we are avoiding threats, it tends to focus everybody on the threats that are in the world and in trying to minimize the influence of those threats on their lives. And yet, this same period is a period of tremendous opportunity for us. So, for example, at the IC² Institute, where I'm executive director, we spend a lot of time thinking about economic development. And a lot of smaller communities outside of cities have struggled in the current economic climate, even though the economy was fairly good up until a few months ago. Those communities had lagged behind. And now there are opportunities there for small communities to engage in bringing more of the supply chain domestic, for example, and participating in warehousing. Because I think there may be a little less just-in-time manufacturing in the years to come after seeing some of the lack of resilience that comes from having a threat in the environment. And so there are lots of opportunities out there. Unfortunately, a lot of people are really find it difficult to focus on those opportunities because when psychologically you're in the mode of avoiding a threat, then threats are the things that loom large in your psyche, whereas those opportunities don't seem as important, which means that we have to make a concerted effort to force ourselves to think about what are some of the opportunities that have been created as a result of the terrible situation that we find ourselves in. And looking for those opportunities is not a disrespectful thing to do. We're not looking for reasons to exploit anything. We're simply looking for what are ways in which there are goals that I've had in my life that I might actually be able to achieve better given the state of the world right now. We didn't wish this state of the world to be true, but that doesn't mean that there can't be positive outcomes that come from it, even though there may be a natural tendency for us to shy away from those. And then finally, the last thing I'll say, just to orient the discussion before we try and take some questions, is it's also important to think about that career path. One of the things that often happens to people, and in the book, I was able to take the stories of several people and weave them through as examples of some of the psychological principles that I talk about. One of the things that I found was that many people who consider changing career paths, perhaps because that career doesn't fit their underlying values, waited until they experienced some kind of personal tragedy before really being willing to pull the trigger on making a career change. That personal tragedy might have been the death of a loved one or an illness or accident or some other, something like that. And often I give the advice to people, well, don't wait for a personal tragedy before you really rethink your level of happiness with the work that you're doing. But one of the things that I think is really important to bear in mind is because we're in the middle of a crisis right now, this has been a time for a lot of us to reckon with what it is that makes us happy. And so I want to end this section of the talk with a little bit of the research on regret. So regret is an interesting topic. It's been studied for a long time by psychologists. And early on, it tended to be studied in the way that many topics in psychology are studied, by looking at college sophomores, who are the fruit flies of psychology research because they're cheap and plentifully available on college campuses where you find a lot of the researchers. And it turns out, if you ask a lot of college sophomores what they regret, most of the things that they regret are dumb things that they did. So they regret getting drunk and yelling at somebody, or not studying for an exam and failing it, or having a fight with a friend. Those are the regrets that they have. There was research by Tom Gilovich and his colleagues in which they took a very different approach. They went to old age homes and got people in their 70s, 80s, and 90s to talk about what they regret. And when you ask older people about their regrets, it turns out that most of the dumb things they did in their lives later became good stories. And so they don't loom large as the regrets people have. Instead, the main regrets that older people tend to express are the things they didn't do rather than the things that they did. And so what that tells us is that when you get to the end of your life, it is the missed opportunities that are going to be the things that are likely to cause you some amount of pain and regret. So the question is, how can you do something now to avoid those regrets? And the way that you can do that is to take advantage of the mental ability for some time travel. Project yourself to the end of your life, look back on that life and ask yourself, what will I regret not having done? And then make a change now while you still have the opportunity, rather than allowing that to remain a regret. And I think if you go through that exercise now and you say, if I were old now, are there aspects of my life, my career, that I would really regret? Are there things I wished I had done with my career that I'm not doing? Now is the time to start trying to engage those things. Now is the time when you could consider a little bit of additional education. Most universities, like the ones that where you went to school, have continuing education programs and love to get their alumni involved in those programs to teach new skills, to help people to shift that career path. So take advantage of that. Find opportunities. Read books on topics that you think will help to expand your range of knowledge. For those of you who are less busy at work right now, are there opportunities to pick up a few new skills that might also enhance your ability to engage in alternate career paths? And I think the more of that you do at this time, the more that you can put yourself in a position that when you reach the end of that career, you will look back on it with some degree of pride and satisfaction. And I say this because I've always said that TGIF, thank God it's Friday, are the 4 saddest letters in the English language. For those of us who, if all we can do is wait to get to the end of the work week because that's when we're going to feel good about what we're doing, that's a real shame. Most of us will spend roughly 70,000 hours at work over the course of our careers, and we'd like to feel like that added up to something. And I think the sooner that you focus on finding work that you find fulfilling and engaging wholeheartedly in that, the more likely you can have that career that will give you the satisfaction that you want. Now, what I'd like to do now is to take some time to address your questions. And as I tell everybody, I'm happy to answer any question that doesn't start with, I have this friend. Zach, what do we got?
Thanks so much, Art. We have quite a few questions, and if people want to continue asking, just that ask a question button below the video, just enter your questions there and we'll get to them as they come in. We have one that I like, asking about if your manager isn't your mentor, how do you navigate a relationship with your mentor, particularly if your manager maybe doesn't have your best career interests at heart?
Yeah, That's a great question. And of course, your manager may not be your mentor. In many cases, your manager isn't going to be your mentor for any number of reasons. Um, and I think almost any of us who've worked for any length of time have had managers who would have been terrible mentors to us. What I think is really important for all of us is to go find those people who have the disposition, the career success that we think we want. Not necessarily the one we have right now. We may find people who we think handle situations in a different way that we wish we could do. I think it's perfectly fine to seek those people out, to invite them, to take them out for, when we get past social distancing, perhaps take them out for a cup of coffee. But even now, to shoot them an email and just say, could we have like just a 10-minute conversation? I'd love to chat with you a little bit about some of the things that you do effectively. And I think one of the things that you want to do there is to use this as an opportunity to gather information from a variety of different people who have perspectives on the career path that you might take. It's always nice when the firm that you're working for takes care of a lot of that, but you really can't count on that happening. And so I think it's really important to seek people out. Now, if you can't find anyone within the firm you're working for, one of the things that can be really valuable is to look for professional society groups in your area or other kinds of meetings that now are generally happening virtually in order to meet some new people in your field. And so, if you're not already a member of a local chapter of a network of a professional society, you might consider joining one. You might also consider connecting up with one of the great civic organizations that often draw on the professionals from a community. And the reason for doing that is that you'll come into contact with other people who can be mentors. Your mentor not only doesn't have to be your manager, it doesn't even necessarily need to be someone who works for the same firm that you do. Zach, what else?
Great, Art. Thanks so much. We have one question here, just asking for any kind of cognitive science advice or insight on how to know when it's time to move on to the next job, or even make maybe a full career. There's a question, full career change is kind of a question related to that, but maybe the more general sense of just how to know when it's time to move on.
Yeah, that's a really great question. One of the chapters in Bring Your Brain to Work is called Move Away, Move On, Move Up. And the elements of that, move away is shift career paths. Move on is to stay in the same career path, but to do it at a different firm. And move up is to really seek another position within your own firm. And so part of the question is, how do you figure out when it's time to do that? And part of the answer to that is, if you are the sort of person who envisions yourself climbing up a career ladder, and not everyone does, right? There are plenty of people who would be content more or less doing the same job for much of their career. But for many people who are focused on advancement, you should actually be thinking about the nature of the career path from the beginning. So part of what you want to know when you take a new job is, what are the skills I need to develop in order to be able to do this job effectively? And this actually raises an important point, because a lot of times we think, well, I shouldn't take on a particular job until I'm 100% qualified to have that job. And that's actually not quite true. Your expectation should be that you are going to have to learn a number of new skills when you take on a new job. And the reason it's important to take this perspective is that a number of people, when they take on a job, end up suffering from a version of what's called imposter syndrome. And imposter syndrome is this belief that you've been hired into a position you don't deserve to be in. And part of the reason you may feel that way is that you look at other people who have that job and you think, well, they're much more qualified than I am. So they must really know what's going on. If they only knew how little I know, then they would never have hired me into this job in the first place. Instead, bear in mind that you have been hired into your job in large part because of the potential that you have to be excellent at it. and that the expectation is you are going to learn a lot as you take that job on. And so you should waste no opportunity to ask for help, to talk about situations in which you're not 100% sure what you're supposed to do yet. I think that's really critical. Now, the reason I'm framing it this way is well, there's two reasons. One, because at the point where you're no longer learning anything in the position that you're in right now, it's probably time to be doing something else. And in fact, it probably shouldn't even come to that point. So as you sit in whatever position you're in, you should be looking at the work that other people are doing and trying to understand not just what skills you need to have in order to succeed at the job you have right now, but also what skills will you need in order to be able to take on jobs that are ahead of yours, and to find opportunities to practice that as well. So I'll give you an example there. One of the other chapters in Bring Your Brain to Work is focused on leadership and leadership ability. One of the hardest things to do when you're put in a leadership position is to delegate to other people, because oftentimes in any given moment, it's probably faster for you to do a particular thing yourself than to ask someone else to do it for the first time. And so a lot of times people have difficulty giving up control of a task to someone else who may not do it that well immediately. But one of the things that misses is that you don't really delegate things, but rather you are constantly trying to find ways to teach other people elements of the skills that are part of your job. And if you want to be an effective delegator, particularly as you rise up to positions that have a little bit more leadership capacity, you need to become skilled at teaching other people elements of your job, which means that as soon as you can, you need to practice that within your organization, helping other people to do some of the things that you know how to do, sharing that expertise. The better that you get at that, and the more reputation you develop for being an effective teacher of the people around you, the more likely you are to be eligible for some of those leadership positions, and the more likely you are to succeed at them once you get them, because you're already in the habit of sharing your knowledge with other people. You know, I think a lot of people are afraid, well, if I teach somebody else to do the things I know how to do, then I become expendable. But there's an old saying that says, if you can't be replaced, you can't be promoted. And I think that's an important one to keep in mind.
That's very interesting, Art, about practicing delegating kind of as soon as you can to be able to move on when it is time. The questions keep coming in. Here's a good one, very relevant for today. Any tips for Zoom interviews?
Tips for Zoom interviews. Yeah, you know, Zoom interviews are tough. One of the things is please get fully dressed. You know, this whole sort of business on top, party on the bottom thing is probably not a good idea in an interview setting. You know, you never know when someone's going to start banging on your door, and you're going to have to get up, and it turns out you're only half dressed. So, you know, please do that. One of the other things that I think is really important to do is if they don't ask for it at the front end, make sure that you have an alternate mode of contact for the interviewer. We are, of course, taxing residential internet to the extreme these days. And so if your interview gets dropped, you want to make sure that you have that you have that alternate contact that you can call up right away. Actually, it's nice to do that because it demonstrates to the interviewer how prepared you are for situations. I'm a big believer in interviews in general, that you should show rather than tell as much as possible. So for example, in every interview, it's extraordinarily important to know as much as is humanly possible about the firm you're interviewing with. Because lots of people go into interviews and say, I'm a real self-starter. I don't need to be told what to do. But if you can demonstrate that because you're already exceptionally well prepared for the interview, you don't need to say it because it's obvious that your level of preparation is obvious. So I think those are a couple of important things. And the other thing that's really important to do is just to find a way to create just a kind of pleasant facial expression. It's really hard when you're all alone to muster the courage to feel just upbeat about things. And so it's really valuable to just think some pleasant thoughts and remember that one of the interviews have all sorts of functions to them, but by the time you've gotten the interview, the hiring manager already knows that you have many of the qualifications that are required for the job. And one of the big things they're trying to figure out is, are you a good fit interpersonally for the organization? And so to the extent that you can try to create some rapport with the interviewer over Zoom, which is much harder to do than when you're in person, that's going to help you a lot. So thinking really happy thoughts is I think a bonus.
Great. We have another question, Art, just asking for any other advice for kind of resumes for getting through that initial filter where they're looking for anything to kind of toss you out of the pile.
Yeah, avoid Comic Sans like the plague. I think it is useful to have a good, crisp statement up front about why you're a good fit to that firm. So lots of resumes these days have a statement up front, kind of a statement of qualification and purpose. Really tailor that to the firm you're applying to. Your resume should be slightly different for every place that you're applying. I think the other thing to bear in mind is everyone on the job market right now is going to have a tremendous amount of patience. There are a lot of people out there. There are not as many jobs out there. And so, work the people that you know in industries, use those personal connections as much as possible, apply really widely, apply to more jobs than you think you need to. This is true in general. It's particularly true right now. And I will say one other thing for those of you who are on the market right now applying for jobs. The thing about applying for jobs right now is it's a lot of hurry up and wait. You check the websites, you apply for some jobs, you send some things in, and then you have to sit around and wait. Obviously one thing you can do is to use the time to learn some new skills, but also see if you can find a way to be of service to others. And that might be volunteering at a local food pantry. It might be doing volunteer work from home to help people who are in need. And again, there are two reasons to do this. Well, there's several reasons to do it. One is having a regular schedule when you're in a difficult job search is extraordinarily important. That regular schedule just keeps you moving day to day. Being of service to others creates positive feeling motivationally. And so I think that can get you through some of the harder days. The other thing is, or the other two things are, one, doing something like some service work right now is another way of showing, not telling about your initiative, because it demonstrates where your real heart is in this. And the other thing about engaging in service work is that often people in prominent positions are also involved in groups that are helping others at this time. And it's amazing who you can end up coming into contact with as a result of doing this work, where in casual conversation, people might find out you're applying for a job. And the next thing you know somebody who's on the hiring committee. So for all of those reasons, I think it's really important to stay engaged.
Great. We have an interesting question, and I think the example applies probably for a lot of folks looking to make a bigger career change or shift. And they're currently working in medicine, and they have more recently realized that they may be really interested in working in law. Obviously, those are very different professions and a fairly big shift. And your question about projecting out into the future, what might you regret? They're thinking they might regret making that change or not actually making that change and staying where they are. But they also have the obvious concerns of, will I be able to get the job I want and make the transition this late and all of that? How, maybe it all boils down, and there's a few questions a little bit like this, but how do you know when you know, basically, to make a change?
Yeah, I think one of the most important things to remember is that that career path is going to be chaotic while you're on it. So the stories that people are able to tell about their careers, those are the things that happen when you look back on your career. In the forward direction, you never know which choice was the most consequential. But I think the thing to remember is, so let's take this example of you're in a medical profession, you think you'd like to go into law. Well, if it's something you care deeply about and you would enjoy that study and that practice and that ability to get revved up for that new career, then that would create an enjoyable chapter of your life. Now, having gone through that experience, you now have a set of qualifications that would be pretty unique. You would have expertise both on the medical side of things and the legal side of things, which opens up all sorts of opportunities, many of which are ones you may not even be considering just yet. I know everyone I know who's successful is someone who has managed to take advantage of opportunities that arose as a result of the preparation that they had done that enabled them to be ready for a particular moment when it came. And so rather than thinking, well, I could plan all of this out now, part of what you want to do is to say, well, this is a path where I think there are things I could do that would make me very happy, recognizing that as you go along that path, new opportunities are going to arise that you hadn't thought of yet. And I'll just say a quick word about the psychology of creativity here. The thing about being creative, about foreseeing the future, is that your ability to envision the future is fundamentally dependent on the existing knowledge you have. There's great research. Annette Karmeloff-Smith has done this, as well as Tom Ward. If you ask people to draw, say, alien creatures, those alien creatures, they aren't quite like Earth creatures, but they're pretty similar, right? They generally speaking are, bilaterally symmetric. They've got, eyes and ears and legs. They might have more eyes and ears and legs than Earth creatures, but they're really similar. They're rooted in our experience. And the same thing is true when we start to envision what our career could look like. We are strongly constrained by the experiences that we've had in our lives in the past. And often the most interesting things that might be out there for us are things that go beyond our experience already. And so by walking down a path like that, getting that new level of education, it opens up chances to see paths for yourself that you've never envisioned that may end up being way more interesting than anything you expected. And I think if you walk into a career change path with your eyes open like that, then you may end up being really surprised by some of the things that you're ultimately able to do.
Great. This is an interesting question. I guess as part of the hiring process, how do you explain a career that's been hindered by depression or other mental illness, or I suppose just any issue maybe in your past?
Yeah, so one of the things about any resume, either at the stage of the application or sometimes at the stage of the interview itself, is that there's usually a standard path people are expecting, and if you deviated from that path in some way, it is useful to give some sort of explanation for that. And I think that any sort of illness, and I think one of the positive things about the current environment is that mental illness is much better understood by the general public as an illness, and no different from any other illness. And so I think it requires much less discussion for people to understand that you may have had a career path that was where you had to take some time off, perhaps because of depression or some other mental disorder. So I think it's okay to give that explanation and to help people to understand how you've gotten to where you are right now. Fundamentally, what people want to know is that they can trust the work that you're going to do for them. And I think that it's important when there are elements about your past that influence how you got where you are, letting people know about those, I think, is valuable. You might say, yeah, but I might lose out on certain jobs that way. And I think that that's true, but you also have to ask yourself, are the jobs that you're losing out on jobs that you would actually want? If you have to hide some fundamental aspect of who you are in order to be able to succeed in a particular job, that firm may not be the ideal one for you. You know, these days we talk a lot, the buzzword now isn't just diversity, it's diversity and inclusion. And the reason that that inclusion piece is so important is because inclusion is the hard part. Diversity means, can I get a group of people together who have a variety of different characteristics? Inclusion means, will I also allow all of those people to bring themselves to work? And I think it's really important that you find places to work that not just accept a variety of people, but accept them to the degree that they can be themselves in the workplace. And you learn a lot about that even through the interview process itself.
Great. Art, I know you have another meeting at the top of the hour, so maybe one final question for today. It just came in a moment ago. I'm a little surprised it wasn't asked earlier, but asking for people graduating now or who just graduated recently or, were just in their first job and have been let go. And now, they have a lot of options, but there's maybe less opportunity than there was before. Just any particular advice for that kind of cohort there?
Yeah. Actually, I've got a piece that should be coming out on the Harvard Business Review site about that in the next couple of weeks. But a couple of things to think about. One is, look carefully at your set of qualifications right now and ask yourself, what is it that I don't know how to do right now that would be really valuable for the career path I'm interested in? There's an awful lot of stuff that we learn to do on the job or after the job starts. And so, if you've always wanted to learn a little computer programming or how to look at data or how to give better presentations, this is a great time to hone some of those skills. If you look at some of the qualifications for some of the jobs that you aspire to, and there are things that they're asking for, maybe certifications that they want, this is a great time to start on a path to picking some of those up. I think that's one important thing to do. And again, the other important thing to do is to engage with people. So really find some professional organizations out there. A lot of them are having virtual meetings right now. Connect up with other people, because you will hear a lot of stories that will change the way that you think about what's going on within the career path that you're thinking about. And then the last thing I'll say is, call up some of the firms and just find out, are there projects that might be coming up on the horizon where there are things you could be doing now to be prepared to get involved in when they start hiring again, because that may give you a sense of how to be where they're going to be in the future rather than where they are right now.
Great, Art. Thank you so much. For all the people who asked, the link to the recording will be available and an email will go out tomorrow with that. And there are also other webinars coming up that folks can check out. Thanks again, Art, and everyone have a wonderful rest of your day and stay healthy. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.